Boa tarde a todos e todas. A gente dá início agora a uma mesa sobre nova arquitetura financeira, organizada pelo Global South Academic Forum e pelo Tricontinental, Instituto de Pesquisa Social. E o tema da mesa de hoje é além do consenso de Washington, traçando os rumos de uma economia mundial multipolar. E eu quero apresentar rapidamente aqui quem vai contribuir com o nosso debate. A gente tem aqui presente o professor Paulo Nogueira Batista Júnior. Ele é um economista brasileiro, foi diretor executivo do FMI, eleito pelo Brasil e por outros 10 países entre 2007 e 2015. Foi também vice-presidente do novo Banco de Desenvolvimento, estabelecido pelos BRICS em Shanghai entre 2015 e 2017. E atualmente ele atua como um economista independente e em 2024 publicou um projeto sobre a reforma do Fundo Monetário Internacional com o Bretton Woods Project. A gente tem também o Emiliano López, que é economista-chefe do Instituto Tricontinental de Pesquisa Social, professor na Universidade de La Plata, na Argentina, e pesquisador do CONICET, da Argentina. E, por fim, o professor Wen Wei, espero que eu tenha falado certo. Ele é professor de economia na Antai College of Economics Management, na Universidade de Jiao, Tong, em Shanghai. É ex-pesquisador sênior e vice-presidente vice-presidente assistente no Federal Reserve Bank dos Estados Unidos entre 2005 e 2021. Ex-professor assistente na Universidade de Cornell, entre 99 e 2005, e na Universidade de Ciência e Tecnologia de Hong Kong, entre 96 e 99. O professor é especialista em macroeconomia, ciclos econômicos, política monetária, macroeconomia chinesa e história da Revolução Industrial. Então, para iniciar esse painel, a gente vai fazer 3 rodadas de debate com os nossos expositores. E a primeira rodada, a gente vai elaborar o partir do diagnóstico da velha crise ou da crise da velha ordem internacional, estabelecendo um pouco do que são as falhas econômicas, financeiras e também teóricas do consenso de Washington. E eu começo com o Emiliano, começando pelos dados e pela macroeconomia. Eu quero te perguntar como que você caracteriza o fracasso fundamental do modelo neoliberal no Ocidente nas últimas décadas, especialmente quando confrontado com o desempenho da China. E o que esse diagnóstico do fracasso e do fracasso a nível comparativo com a China nos diz sobre uma virada para um mundo multipolar. Você tem de 10 a 12 minutos.
Muy bien. Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Muy contento de compartir con ustedes este debate, esta discusión. En primer lugar, creo que es importante tener presente que el proyecto neoliberal comienza con la crisis del orden social fordista o del orden social de los años dorados del capitalismo, luego de Bretton Woods, del acuerdo de Bretton Woods en la posguerra. Y la crisis de ese proyecto instauró, al menos en 3 o 4 aspectos importantes, una nueva lógica de acumulación global en Occidente, puntualmente, pero también en otros países de Oriente. Y entre ellas, entre esta nueva lógica de acumulación global, encontramos, en primer lugar, la financiarización, la lógica financiera por sobre la lógica productiva como un elemento característico de la nueva etapa. Encontramos también la idea de la privatización de los bienes públicos y los servicios públicos como estrategia general de nuevos espacios de acumulación de capital. Encontramos una nueva ofensiva sobre el trabajo basada en una revolución tecnoproductiva, pero también en una flexibilización fuerte del mundo del trabajo, de los mercados de trabajo a nivel global. Y en cuarto lugar, y creo muy relevante, encontramos un proceso de deslocalización productiva, que quizá es, creo yo, uno de los elementos más importantes para pensar los nuevos procesos de industrialización del sur global. Ahora bien, este proyecto, el proyecto neoliberal, como un proyecto centrado en Occidente y centrado, sobre todo, impulsado por los sectores más ricos del mundo. En buena medida, lo que hizo fue provocar severas crisis vinculadas a estas lógicas financieras por sobreproductivas, deslocalización por sobre proyectos nacionales de desarrollo y flexibilización del mundo del trabajo por sobre derechos generales y mejoras en los ingresos populares. Entonces, en algún punto creo que la crisis de ese proyecto neoliberal era visible, ¿no? Empezó a ser visible en los años 90, ya a mediados de los años 90, la última década del siglo XX, pero sobre todo a partir de la crisis que se llamó la crisis de los .com y por supuesto de la crisis de 2008. ¿No? La crisis de 2007-2008 marcó, si se quiere, desde mi punto de vista, una inflexión muy fuerte entre dos proyectos o dos modelos de desarrollo. Un modelo basado en la lógica productiva, del cual China, creo yo, es el principal artífice, pero también otros países del sur global, y un modelo basado en la dinámica financiarizada, plenamente financiarizada, que es el modelo estadounidense. Y ante esto, creo que hay una paradoja interesante que se produce, que es que la lógica financiera, la lógica de la financiarización, lleva o conlleva consigo, dentro de la misma lógica financiera, la crisis de ese orden de Occidente. ¿No? La misma lógica financiera produce mayores ganancias en el corto plazo, pero genera, en buena medida, la decadencia de ese orden occidental que surgió de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y que está en discusión, que seguramente los colegas puedan detallar mucho más sobre esto. Y a la vez que lleva a esta lógica de crisis, abre oportunidades para los países del sur global para discutir cuáles serían estrategias alternativas de desarrollo basadas en la ruptura con la idea unipolar del mundo y con la idea de las finanzas como centro de la acumulación de capital.
Vou passar agora para o Paulo Nogueira Batista. E aí eu queria saber, Paulo, você que viu de dentro, né, que estava na diretoria do FMI, qual é a falha financeira ou institucional central do acordo de Bretton Woods e principalmente, por que foi necessário construir uma alternativa, uma instituição completamente nova, né, no caso do novo Banco de Desenvolvimento, ao invés de reformar a antiga?
Well, Juliana, in my time at the IMF, I learned a few things, some positive and some negative. No? And the IMF was actually a major instrument of the Washington Consensus, right? Became an instrument of the Washington Consensus. It has many flaws. The Washington Consensus has many flaws. I would highlight a few. First, it should be understood that Washington Consensus, or neoliberalism, which is the ideology that the Washington Consensus promoted, is actually something very old. It's actually not neo at all. I used to talk about this in Brazil and say we need to abandon this prefix neo because actually it's Paleo-Liberalism. Why do I say that? Because the so-called neoliberalism was a return to pre-Keynesian policies, which were actually anachronistic in the present world situation. So much so that the developed countries where this ideology was created did not follow it fully, not even in the heyday of so-called neoliberalism. Now they've abandoned it completely. No? But we in Latin America, Brazil less than other countries, Argentina was an extreme practitioner of the Washington Consensus. Brazil also, but less so. And if you look at the countries in the world, those that did not accept the Washington Consensus did very well. For example, China, notably China. Those that did accept it, for example, Argentina, also Brazil to a like extent, were not successful in the last 30 years. So I think, what are the problems of this Washington Consensus, to return to your question? For example, financially speaking, the economy suffered what is known as financialization, which among other things consists of a bloated financial sector, which grows out of all proportion, dominates the economic system, dominates economic policies and the political process through lobbying and campaign financing. So you have these big banks, big in financial institutions, big hedge funds, they dominate the scene. So for example, Professor, I don't know if you know, in Brazil, we have we don't have large public commercial banks like you have in China, dominating the Chinese system. We have private banks, like for example, Itaú, Bradesco, Santander. Well, you don't have that. You don't have a Bradesco or Itaú or Santander here in China. And thank you. Be thankful that you don't. Because these banks produce nothing, or very little, let's say. They add very little, and they create enormous problems, political and economic. So I think financialization was a major issue. And very much linked to that, the liberalization of the capital account, which Brazil did a little later than Argentina, but also did to a larger extent. Why was that a problem? Again, I compare to China. China never liberalized fully its capital account. It remained protected from what? From the swings in international capital movements. I think China studied Brazil's experience, Argentina's experience, said, no, that's not the way we're going to do it. China remained protected against the vagaries of international finance, whereas we opened the door to these instabilities. So, in short, the Washington Consensus consists of an exportation of policies and practices that are old, not viable in the present world, that even in the heyday of neoliberalism, the advanced country did not implement fully. So why, when I was in the second question, Julian, what did I learn from this Washington Consensus in the IMF? In a nutshell, I would say that what I learned is that the system, the IMF, the World Bank, and the other aspects of the Western economic system, financial and economic international system, are unreformable. Why? Because the West does not allow any fundamental reform in these institutions. It wants to retain full control. So just to give an example among many others, if you do a revision of the voting power in the IMF or in the World Bank, what would happen? First of all, China would have to increase enormously, because under any conceivable formula, China is underrepresented substantially. Now exactly that is what the United States and Europe will not accept, and Japan, by the way. So China needs to be kept underrepresented, so there's no reform. This is one reason only, but it's a major one. Now, so we took the logical conclusion from that, and that's why I ultimately moved from Washington to Shanghai in my life, because at one point the BRICS really realized, the five then members, that no reform of the Western institutions would be forthcoming. They want to stay in the 20th century. So we said to them, okay, stay in the 20th century, we'll go to the 21st. And Shanghai is the place to go, because it's visually the 21st century. If you compare visually Manhattan to Shanghai, you feel Manhattan 20th, Shanghai 21st. So luckily we have the bank, the New Development Bank, here in Shanghai, right? And not only the New Development Bank, but also we have the AIIB in Beijing. And I noticed, Professor, something very interesting, which you may perhaps enlighten us on, which is a decision announced by President Xi early October to create a development bank of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I wonder what that means, because we already have two, NDB, AIIB, we now have a third one in the plan. And we also have a contingent reserve arrangement created by the BRICS. Unfortunately, this is not working. It's basically a pilot project, frozen as such by our very conservative central banks. So we need new institutions. We started with new institutions. But to be realistic, I can come back to that if you want. To be realistic, our progress has been patchy. I mean the BRICS, né? The BRICS and the Global South. Our progress has been insufficient and patchy. So we're moving forward, but at a slow pace from my point of view.
Muito bem. Então, ainda na fase de diagnósticos, quero passar para o professor Wen, que tem um trabalho de crítica sistemática à nova economia institucional, especialmente as teorias do Acemoglu. E gostaria que você explicasse para a gente quais os erros históricos e teóricos centrais naquela narrativa que apregoa, né, instituições em primeiro lugar, e como a sua análise da verdadeira Revolução Industrial inglesa, né, com violência estatal, colonialismo, guerras comerciais, como ela se contradiz em relação ao consenso de Washington. O que isso revela sobre por que o caminho adotado pela China funciona em contraposição ao caminho adotado pelos países que prescreveram e adotaram o consenso de Washington fracassaram.
Okay. Yes. Actually, I would like to share with everyone here not only about China's development experience, also about my personal experience of how my view, my perspective of the world changed. I was trained as a neoliberal macroeconomist. So essentially, so that program of intensive training, mathematics, everything, everybody was essentially brainwashed. Because in the economics program in the US, maybe everywhere, maybe including Argentina and Brazil today, people do not read history. They do not read history of industrialization, history of development. Instead, they start with micro, macro econometrics, those what Donald Coase called blackboard economics. And after you pass your PhD core exam, you write a thesis in mathematical model, then you become a so-called economist. Then you were sent to the university to teach economics, or you're sent to the IMF or World Bank teaching developing countries' government how to do economics. So this is an irony, because PhD and professors in economic field, they do not know anything about the real world. They do not even know the history of economic development. So therefore, everything they know about economics is from the textbooks, from the mathematical models. And that model itself does not even explain the US experience of development in the 19th century. So none of the Western capitalist countries today we see were developed based on the so-called economic theory we are learning today. So this by itself is a big problem. So later on, only after I start to think about China's economy, first of all, you realize that by the Western economic theory, either that be neoclassical or the new institutional, China would be the worst possible economy on earth, because nothing China has been practicing fit into those economic theory or Washington consensus. But yet in reality, China is one of the best performing economies. So that first struck me, either the real world is wrong or the theory is wrong. But according to famous economic Nobel Prize winners in the US, they think anytime if you find, I was told, if theory and practice do not consistent with each other, the real world is wrong, not the theory. So that means the economic theory is a religion. You cannot change that. So later on, especially after I start to read the true history of industrialization, industrial revolution of Great Britain, France, Germany, US, Japan, then finally realize the whole economic profession, the whole economic theory is completely wrong. It's so much misguided. Now the Washington Consensus was built upon this kind of theoretical framework. Even the so-called new institutional theory advocated by Acemoglu, he's essentially a blackboard economist. He's very good at math. Whenever he talks about history, you can see the historians already criticize him. He wrote a famous book, Why Nations Fail. That's full of mistakes. his interpretation, his treatment of history is wrong. But yet economists cannot tell. They all think he's great, and they even give him Nobel Prize. He turned every causal relationship upside down. Institutions is not first. It's endogenously built upon the practice of development. Always comes later. The reason Great Britain started the Industrial Revolution, not because Great Britain had established very nice institutions first. No, they had very poor institutions. Only as the economy develops, then they create institutions to respond to the social changes. It's always endogenous and reflects local conditions. And so therefore, that's why today we not only need to reflect upon, why the Washington Consensus failed. Also, we need to reflect upon why the entire economic sphere, the economic theory we have been teaching the entire world is wrong. But of course, what's the alternative? And we need the people, to eventually come up. So now let me say a few about why the Washington Consensus is wrong. If we remember, there are several so-called short slogans in the Washington Consensus. Privatization, marketization, liberalization, and cutting back government spendings, right? That's essentially the spirit of Washington Consensus. This sounds correct, especially you look at them from the neoclassical theoretical point of view. But in practice, why that's wrong, as the two professors already put out. When you apply the Washington Consensus to the developing country, even to middle-income countries like Argentina and Brazil, it creates financial disaster. Well, you can conjecture why the Westerners want to propose Washington Consensus. Because you look at their development of industrialization, all the West countries, especially the US, is already at the high stage of so-called financial capitalism. Their most important drive for them, look at the US today, is finance. And the financial capitalism by its nature, it has no national borders. They want to penetrate it to every corner of the world. Before, they used, in the 19th, 18th century, they used navy power to penetrate those places and to grab their market, grab their raw materials. But once they reach financial capitalism, they wanted their capital to penetrate every part of the world. So the Washington Consensus essentially gives them the excuse and make the developing countries no longer vigilant. And they open up not just the goods market, they open up their financial market. We know financial capital is so liquid. It comes in a second, and it leaves in a second, and it damages your entire economy. And China's development experience in that relation, China's economic reform compared to that in Russia, China had the order right, no financial liberalization. Even today, China's still holding that, right? Started with from the most basic fundamental layer, which is production. And even the entire production or the manufacturing kingdom was built step by step. In the 1980s in China, government promoted township village enterprises. They were very primitive, but they were very important as a foundation to create a market for the next stage move up, which is mass production of textile or light industrial goods. That stage was also important. It created the market for heavy industries. So China moved up the ladders one by one. Then eventually, you want to, look at how to create a modern kind of a socialist style financial market. But China's still on the way of learning, crossing the river by touching the stone. And the textbook cannot tell you how to do that. Anything to tell you must be wrong, because those are created by mathematicians. And the mathematicians, we know, they know nothing about the real world. So this is how we got all into this trouble. Look at the Soviet Union, look at the East European countries, Russia, because of the lesson two, they took the Washington Consensus for granted. And China had this advantage during the social planning era, everybody, my parents and myself, when I was little, we studied the history of capitalism. So when Deng Xiaoping was doing the opening up, we still know what the capitalism is about. So therefore, China was very careful and taking this gradualism approach, because how can we get engaging with capitalism, how to engage with market. But you look at Russia, look at Ukraine, you look at other East European countries. They forgot everything what the Marxism told them about capitalism. They think, oh, just government pull back, then market will flourish. Turns out it's the mafia flourish. What's the nature of capitalism? It took the Western world 500 years of plundering, colonization, enslavement, and by the pursuit of profit without any moral foundation. Therefore, they were able to generate lots of profit and use that profit to support the manufacturing. And only later on, they entered the stage of financial capitalism. And the Russian, the Soviet Union government, they were so naive. They think the government pull back, then capitalism will emerge, will flourish. Turns out it's just mafias. And what we don't know about Western history, that's the problem. You look at the entire 300 years of Renaissance in Italy, was mafia controlling everything. That's why Industrial Revolution did not take place in Italy. You think, oh, capitalism bring about everything, science and industrial technology. How come it did not happen in Italy? Italy was the birthplace of capitalism. No industrial revolution. Not even in Netherlands, which was far more advanced than United Kingdom. Industrial revolution did not take place there either. So there's lots of things which economists, we do not understand. And we say, oh, let the government pull back and let's create capitalism. It will come by itself. That is bound to generate disasters. So that's.
Muito bem, muito obrigada por esse diagnóstico. E aí eu quero partir para a segunda rodada, onde espero que a gente consiga dar passos para traçar alternativas concretas, pensar uma nova arquitetura e explorar soluções práticas e teóricas que estão sendo construídas. Aí eu quero começar pelo Paulo Nogueira Batista. Voltando ao final da tua fala, quando tu fez referência ao novo Banco de Desenvolvimento, quero que tu explore um pouco mais quais mecanismos que diferenciam o novo Banco de Desenvolvimento e se os financiamentos em moedas locais, o acordo contingente de reservas, se esses mecanismos são suficientes ou em que medida eles podem criar soberania financeira real e desafiarem, né, economicamente o poder do dólar.
Bom, primeiro, nós temos que entender o momento, a razão principal para criar essas novas instituições por parte dos BRICS, né? O novo Banco de Desenvolvimento e o Acordo Contingente de Reservas, o Contingent Reserve Arrangement. Nós nos deparamos com a impossibilidade de reformar as instituições de Washington. Então, de uma maneira muito assim discreta, típica dos chineses, mas também dos outros BRICS, nós dissemos, ok, vamos fazer o nosso próprio caminho. Continuamos lá em Washington com os nossos diretores, com os nossos representantes, mas vamos criar novas instituições. Então, eu participei tanto da criação do novo Banco de Desenvolvimento quanto da criação do Acordo Contingente de Reservas. Eu posso dizer a vocês, a nossa intenção era criar, com o novo Banco de Desenvolvimento, uma alternativa ao Banco Mundial e com o Acordo Contingente de Reservas, uma alternativa ao Fundo Monetário Internacional. Quando nós anunciamos isso, eu posso dizer a vocês que eu estava em Washington ainda, a preocupação em Washington era enorme. Eu fui chamado, fui visitado pelo Banco Mundial. A diretora-gerente do FMI, Christine Lagarde, chamou os diretores dos BRICS para tentar entender o que estava sendo feito com o Acordo Contingente de Reservas. Havia uma preocupação. Então, o que aconteceu? Na concepção do banco e do Acordo Contingente de Reserva, nós cometemos alguns erros, sabe? Assim, estratégicos, alguns operacionais e alguns estratégicos que estão cobrando seu preço. Mas antes de entrar nos erros, o que nós tínhamos de diferente? Por exemplo, o novo Banco de Desenvolvimento. O que é isso? é a primeira vez em que se cria um Banco Multilateral de Desenvolvimento, AIIB e o nosso, né? O Banco Asiático de Investimento em Infraestrutura e o NBD, foram o quê? A primeira vez que se criou uma instituição multilateral por países do Sul para países do Sul. Né? Isso não existia antes, é uma experiência inédita. Né? E o que nós, por exemplo, quisemos fazer? O NBD é dentro do modelo geral inaugurado pelo Banco Mundial. Países trazem capital, o banco usa o capital para alavancar com tomada de recursos no mercado. Né? Esse é o modelo inaugurado pelo Banco Mundial. O que nós fizemos, entretanto? Nós seguimos esse modelo, porém os projetos seriam feitos sem a imposição de condicionalidades e sem interferência excessiva, sem interferência do banco nos projetos de desenvolvimento dos países tomadores de empréstimos. Né? Então a ideia era abandonar a condicionalidade. Repara que nosso objetivo era ambicioso, era um banco que rivalizasse com o Banco Mundial. Né? Aí, o que faltou? Até hoje, o banco não tem muitos membros, tem 10. Eu tive a oportunidade de visitar o banco ontem, pela primeira vez em muitos anos, e eu vi lá 10 bandeiras, só 10. As 5 dos fundadores, Brasil, Rússia, Índia, China e África do Sul, e mais 5, Emirados Árabes, Algéria, Bangladesh, e 2 outros que agora me escapam, sabe? Então, 10 países é bom, mas não é suficiente para constituir um banco global, né? E no ponto específico que a Juliane levantou, que é o uso de moedas locais, o que é isso? É sair do âmbito do dólar e do euro e operar em outras moedas. Isso foi feito até agora, foi feito, mas ainda não é preponderante. O banco ainda é preponderantemente dolarizado. E a única moeda que tem sido usada pelo banco para captar e para emprestar é o renminbi. Acho que sobretudo na captação. O banco emite muito bônus aqui, né? Agora, qual foi um dos erros estratégicos que nós cometemos? Eu só adoto como desculpa o seguinte: nós estávamos em 2014, quando o banco foi criado, né? Em 2014, nós não tínhamos esse geopolitical, essa ruptura geopolítica que hoje nós temos. Então, nós construímos um banco integrado ao sistema internacional do mercado de capitais ocidental e ao dólar. Resulta que esse banco é hoje incapaz, ou incapaz não vou dizer, mas é muito difícil para esse banco assim constituído romper o cerco ocidental. Você sabe, por exemplo, que o novo Banco de Desenvolvimento, não empresta para a Rússia desde 2022 por causa das sanções ocidentais, do medo que o banco tem de sofrer sanções caso opere com um fundador do banco. Olha a gravidade do assunto, olha a gravidade do problema. Não só o novo Banco de Desenvolvimento não faz operações novas com a Rússia, como não desembolsa nas operações já contratadas. Então o novo Banco de Desenvolvimento está violando contratos juridicamente perfeitos com a Rússia, por causa do Ocidente, entende? Então, se hoje eu fosse começar de novo, eu garantiria que o banco tivesse um modelo diferente. Aí eu pergunto, será que não é isso que está na cabeça dos chineses, quando eles propuseram a criação de um novo banco da Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Porque o AIIB sofre do mesmo problema que o NBD sofre nesse ponto. Também está intimamente integrado aos mercados internacionais de capital. Então, talvez o que esteja na cabeça dos chineses, especulação, não ouvi isso de nenhum chinês, não é nada de inside information que eu vou dizer, seria um processo pelo qual você criaria um banco novo, complementar aos 2 bancos que nós já temos, um em Beijing e outro em Xangai. Esse novo banco, ele captaria em renminbi e outras moedas nacionais dos países membros, emprestaria em moedas outras que não o dólar e o euro, exclusivamente, não iria pedir rating a Moody's, Fitch, S&P, usaria os ratings, por exemplo, das agências de crédito, de classificação de crédito da China, né? E operaria, assim, portanto, independente de sanções. Com que instrumentos os americanos sancionariam um banco assim constituído? Esse banco assim poderia emprestar para a Rússia, Irã, Coreia do Norte, todos os países que o Ocidente colocou na lista negra, estariam numa lista branca desse novo banco, né? Então, a minha sugestão aos amigos chineses é que, se é que já não estão pensando assim, seria considerar a criação de um banco diferente dos que existem hoje. E não sei se eu estou me excedendo, estou, né?
Tem tempo ainda.
Tem tempo ainda? Você me faz um sinal, caso eu esteja falando demais. Acordo com contingente de reservas é o que ele representava? Veja, era um mecanismo de assistência de balanço de pagamentos que deveria ser independente do fundo. Ele não é, porque apenas 30% da capacidade de tomar recursos por parte dos países é desvinculada do FMI, 70% está vinculada, 70% estão vinculados ao FMI. Então esse CRA está muito, se é para ser uma alternativa que se subordina ao Fundo Monetário Internacional. Se vocês me perguntarem por que nós não conseguimos desviar disso, tem uma razão. Os nossos bancos centrais totalmente avessos a qualquer... Na verdade, se os nossos bancos centrais pudessem, nem teriam criado esse arranjo contingente de reservas. Mesmo o Banco Central da China não é entusiasmado, entende? E o que eles fizeram? Muito espertamente, eles tomaram conta do arranjo. Hoje, os bancos centrais dos países, os 5, né, controlam o arranjo e ele não opera, não existe. Ele existe como piloto, mas não fez nenhuma operação até hoje. Nenhuma. Em 10 anos, entende? Então, we have a long way to go. Nós temos um longo caminho a percorrer, tanto no NBD quanto no Acordo Contingente de Reservas, para fazer o que nós pretendíamos quando lançamos essas duas instituições. E agora surgiu um tema completamente novo, que é a desdolarização. É um tema complexo, mas in a nutshell, em resumo muito resumido, nós precisaríamos criar uma nova moeda de reserva, alternativa ao dólar, acoplada a um novo sistema de pagamentos, alternativo ao SWIFT, e a uma nova instituição emissora alternativa às existentes. Um banco emissor internacional. Quem criaria isso? Na minha opinião, um subgrupo de países BRICS e não BRICS, não necessariamente todos os BRICS, mas também alguns países de fora dos BRICS, que estariam em condições de dar credibilidade, construir de forma cuidadosa uma instituição sólida, confiável, que colocasse lá uma nova moeda como alternativa às moedas existentes. Porque hoje nós estamos numa situação em que não tem para onde correr. Para onde a gente pode correr? Para o ouro. E o ouro explodindo de preço, fica caríssimo, não é? E ainda mais tem o seguinte, o ouro, para ser líquido como reserva, você tem que, na verdade, deter certificados de ouro contra o ouro físico, né? Só que esses certificados, quando emitidos pelo Ocidente, não são confiáveis, porque são piratas, confiscam, entende? Então não pode manter nem reservas em Londres, nem reservas em Nova York, e nem emitir certificados, aceitar a emissão de certificados ocidentais. Então teríamos que armazenar o ouro nos nossos países e emitir, se for o caso, emitir certificados aqui, ou aqui em Shanghai, ou em São Paulo, em outras centrais, outras capitais nossas, entendeu? Capitais ou cidades grandes nossas. E seria, mas o fundamental é entender o seguinte, no modelo atual só existe uma alternativa, agora só existe uma, ao dólar e ao euro, é o renminbi. Então, ou os chineses aceitam uma large scale, uma ampla internacionalização das suas moedas, ou nós formamos um novo sistema que não é global, que é plurilateral, mas que teria que ter, nós estávamos conversando antes, a Juliane, o Emiliano e eu, né? Teria que ser não só vontade política, mas capacidade técnica de construir algo que fosse sólido e gerasse uma moeda crível, né?
Muito bem. O teu livro tem traduzido? O Brasil não cabe no quintal de ninguém?
Não tem.
Uma excelente fonte de análise, né, do que foi a tua participação no FMI, no NDB. Sugiro você traduzir esse livro e publicar aqui.
No que diz respeito à minha participação no NBD e no Acordo com as Reservas, eu tenho um livro em inglês que chama The BRICS and the Financing Mechanisms They Created. Uma avaliação da criação e dos primeiros anos de funcionamento desses dois mecanismos. Foi publicado pela Anthem Press. Mas é menor do que não é uma tradução
Earlier, when you spoke English, I could understand. I can follow better. But now you switch to Argentine.
To Portuguese.
To Portuguese.
I hope you've more or less understood, because I would be very curious to learn what sort of reaction a Chinese scholar would have to the observations I made about China, renminbi and so forth.
Bom, vou passar para o Wen Yi e também quero partir de um elemento que você já trouxe na sua fala introdutória, quando falou sobre o desenvolvimento chinês, as características, né, de um passo por vez, e te perguntar se esse modelo de desenvolvimento embrionário, que mostra que a industrialização tem que seguir algumas etapas sequenciais, né, não saltar direto para a indústria pesada, por exemplo. A partir dessa análise, quero te perguntar como o caminho da reforma chinesa pós-78, né, começando com empresas municipais e rurais, em vez da terapia de choque, como que esse caminho, vamos dizer, validou essa lógica do desenvolvimento embrionário a partir de etapas sequenciais, né? Dado que, por exemplo, a Rússia, o leste europeu ou a América Latina foram experiências falhas nesse caminho, né, apregoado pelas potências ocidentais, e que a China ensina as demais nações sobre a necessidade de ter forte capacidade estatal, política industrial, desenvolvimento sequencial paciente, né, versus essa receita do consenso de Washington de privatização e liberalização imediata.
Yes, even though this is actually a more involved issue, but I can try to make it simple and short. So let me point out several basic principles I think the current economics has not realized. Number one, I think even though everybody is advised to read Adam Smith, but I think today I think we fail to understand Adam Smith. Because when people talk about Adam Smith, they just think about an invisible hand. That's a killer. That's an ideology. The most important message, if Adam Smith has at all, is the following statement. Division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. We know that why do we have firms? Because they are more competitive, more powerful than individual, and they are more organized, therefore they become more productive. Within any firm, there's no market. Market mechanism cannot work within firm. If you adopt a market mechanism, the organization collapses. So when the Western theory advocate market invisible hand, that's a double-edged sword. The intention, if I want to say that blindly, was to destroy developing countries' potential to develop. Therefore, you become their market. They come in to plunder even in the 18th century or in the modern way. So therefore, in order to understand this, what Adam Smith failed to point out is that where does market come from? Without market, no people want to engage in specialization, adopting new technology. This is the place where Adam Smith failed to point out. Market is a public goods, the most fundamental one, which can only be created by the state. So the Washington consensus want to destroy developing countries' state capacity. All those liberalization, financialization, meant to destroy the state capacity of developing countries. When you no longer have state capacity, how can you help to create a market? You look at Russia, look at Ukraine, look at those other European countries. There's no market. It's just mafias. But China has the largest market precisely because the government know that creating market requires the state involvement. So that's why in China there's a saying, what's the Chinese message? There's a lot of things, but one simple sentence summarized by local people in China. What's China's secret? Let me first say that in Chinese, and I translate that into English. Okay. 政府搭台，企业唱戏. That means government set up the stage, and private enterprises perform. So they are the perform dancers. But where's the stage? Government set up the stage. The government has an enormous role to play in creating market. The market essentially is a stage on which private enterprises can play and the state enterprises can play. They compete, but you need a platform.
Where does this statement come from?
This is from China's local people. I don't know originally where from. Everybody knows.
Great one.
So I think that itself deserves a Nobel Prize in economics. That's just a simple. Also, you look at how the Britain kick-started industrial revolution, precisely because the British government, the Molochs, created a market, and a global market, of course, through evil means, through colonization, navy power. But the ultimate goal was to create a market for their entrepreneurs. But Qing China, they didn't do anything to create a market for their entrepreneurs, so their firms were completely wiped out. And during the reform of Deng Xiaoping, the Russian leaders, they did not know this. They just pulled back. Deng Xiaoping said, no, we create a platform for the actors to perform. So every level of government officials, they engaged in creating platform for enterprises, for individuals to act upon. That's very important. And also, on top of that, I would say the development has to go through sequential stages, because during the social planning era, you could say the government was also trying to create a platform, for the nations to perform, but if the sequence was wrong, the entire economy was not profitable. For example, heavy industry, on one hand, is important for military defense. We know that. If you rely on the Western powers to give you the weapons, of course, you're dead. But that's a heavy industry, very costly. So the two questions is how to make that profitable. Turns out the market base for heavy industry to become profitable is light industry. Without light industry, heavy industry will not be profitable because they do not have a sufficient large size of market. Even you build up a car, 10,000, 100,000 individual components. Every individual one has to be mass produced. And annual production of automobile has to reach something like 1 million in order to reduce the price to make it competitive, profitable. But you produce 1 million car in the 1970s of China, even if you had the technology, where can you sell it? There's no market. So you have to sequentially build up the market, eventually to support automobiles. And China started reform 1980s, 90s to build a market for township village enterprises. Very small, affordable, and they also create larger market for textile industries. And later on, the textile industry flourished everywhere. Mass production and some other light consumer goods created the market for heavy industry, for machineries, for transportation. So this climb up the ladders by correct sequence, correct steps, eventually make the entire economy very profitable without relying on international financial institutions. International financial institutions is important only to a certain degree, just like the Federal Reserve Bank in the US, is when there's a time of crisis as the last resort. But you cannot just rely on that all the time. Then you'll be in trouble. China's all the investment come from domestic savings. But how can you have domestic savings? You have to make every part of the economy profitable so you can save. It's not like this. People about saving, consumers are so poor, how can you save? No. According to Mr. Keynes, national saving is not the same as individual saving. National saving eventually is national investment. Where does that come from? You look at Africa, so there's no saving. Africa has lots of saving. Where? They're underground. They're all their savings, but they are not able to tap that. They are not able to use that. You have to develop manufacturing, eventually make that saving become part of your realized national saving. So if the economy is on the right path of industrialization, the entire economy is so profitable, you have so much saving, you no longer need to rely on international financial institutions to borrow. So this does not say international financial institutions is not important, but because for many developing countries, when they start low, for many big projects, they need to finance. Okay, but you cannot just rely on that. You have to eventually have to pay back. How can you pay back? You have to ensure the money you borrowed to make an investment, eventually that investment has a huge return. And in order for investment to have huge return, it has to be the right project what is the right project? It fits into your stage of development. You know, if you're still in the kind of 80% of population are all farmers, you build up a highway, that investment will be wasted because it does not actually increase your productivity. That's too far away from you. You rather, you know, you build a 1 mile of high-speed train that can give you actually 10,000 miles of local primitive road. That's even perhaps more important for your stage of development. So therefore, developing countries also need to be smart, need to understand at a different stage of investment, even infrastructure project is different. Okay, so therefore, when we come back to financial institutions international, the current Western-controlled financial institutions does not serve developing countries' purpose. They are created to serve their own purpose because they can no longer physically colonize you anymore after World War II. They need to find another way to colonize you. That's financial capitalism. They need institutions to trap you into a scenario which you think is good for you, but actually not. Why? Because you open up your market, privatize everything. You have no more state capacity to control your own destiny. Then the capital just come in and wipe you out. I mean, at the same time, may generate some benefit for your rich people, but not for the majority of the mass. So that's the problem. So now, once we realize this trouble, this fundamental problem for Western-controlled financial institutions, so developing countries need to create their own institutions. Again, let's follow the China's, experience. Number one, why Qing China, or even the Republic of China before the communism took power, was so incapable. The entire nation was not organized. They become the prey of the Western powers. It is communism which organized the nation so they can start to take the destiny into their own hands. Of course, they went through two stages. The first stage we know is social planning, which built state capacity, but was not very profitable because they just all they did not access the global market. The second stage after Deng Xiaoping's reform, they kept the state capacity instead of destroying it like Gorbachev or Yeltsin. They kept the state capacity, but reorient their target just to do the economy, help develop, invite foreigners to come and to enhance your productivity, and engage in manufacturing. Then they started this entire process of climbing up the industrialization ladders stage by stage, eventually come to today. So today's government is still completely focused on enhancing the productivity of manufacturing. Finance is just a tool to facilitate manufacturing. It is not a goal of itself. If you make it finance or banks as a goal of itself, you have a big trouble. Actually, that's the mistake UK made, US also made. Now US has no more manufacturing, just finance, even though they can still support rich people, but the economy is in deep trouble. So therefore, for developing countries, you need to build up manufacturing. And banks, financial institutions is a tool to facilitate that. Should not have its own independent function. So in that regard, that's also part of China's experience. That's why they kept state-owned banks, because they know if we privatize that, as Professor just mentioned out in Brazil, they pursue their own interest. They no longer care about manufacturing the state national interest anymore. That they become part of the Western capital, financial capital. They collude with U.S. financial sector. They completely abandoned Brazilians. That's not good. That's essentially what happened in Russia, in Ukraine. So China still have tight control on the entire financial sector because they want to make sure the financial sector serve manufacturing.
Emiliano, eu queria te fazer duas perguntas. A primeira é que na tua primeira fala você fez referência à financiarização ser um elemento paradoxal, que por um lado aprofunda o lucro extraordinário, por outro lado gesta, né, a sua própria crise. Então, olhando para frente, assim, né, que obstáculos que você identifica que estão colocados para a construção de uma ordem multipolar? E a segunda, eu queria que tu comentasse um pouco, a partir de uma análise dos críticos ocidentais, dialogasse com a premissa de que a China, né, é um capitalismo de Estado ou que emula uma mesma lógica colonialista.
Bueno, sobre el primer punto, creo que tanto Paulo como el profesor Wen han dicho elementos, han planteado elementos muy importantes. En primer lugar, la idea de que efectivamente la financiarización es un mecanismo, hoy es un mecanismo imperial. Es un mecanismo que opera sobre los países del sur global como extracción de ganancias, extracción de excedentes desde los países del sur hacia los centros financieros de Occidente de una manera automática, que es algo diferente a los procesos de, si se quiere, del imperialismo británico. Es una lógica automática. Por ejemplo, voy a poner el ejemplo de mi país para no ofender a ningún país hermano. En mi país, directamente, en Argentina, directamente el capital financiero opera sobre especulación cambiaria, básicamente funcionando el tipo de cambio, y el mecanismo de la deuda externa. Son dos mecanismos que fomentan la necesidad permanente de adquirir dólares. Por eso el debate de la desdolarización es tan importante, no solo para los países con capacidad de instalarlo, que son, tal cual lo planteaba Paulo, los países de los BRICS y, si se quiere, los países más grandes del sur global, sino también para el resto de los países. Porque efectivamente romper con la lógica de imposición automática de extracción de excedentes desde el sur a través de mecanismos financieros es una necesidad urgente. Y esto lleva a un punto que el profesor Wen planteaba, yo creo con muy buen criterio, que es el punto de cuánto es si queremos, la tasa de acumulación de capital de los países del sur. Más baja que en otros países, más baja que en China, ¿no? Del resto de los países del sur global, más baja que en China. ¿Por qué? Bueno, hay diversas explicaciones. Yo creo que una de ellas está vinculada a la financiarización. La lógica de desvío de recursos hacia las finanzas y a la especulación financiera, ¿no? Sobre todo los derivados y los activos financieros más volátiles y por tanto más rentables, generan en buena medida si se quiere, ese círculo vicioso, ¿no? Esa extracción de excedentes y lo quitan del sistema de circulación y de acumulación de capital productivo. Entonces no nos permiten procesos de industrialización, por tanto no nos permiten procesos de generación de empleo, por tanto no nos permiten procesos de autonomía nacional, que es en definitiva la búsqueda de un proyecto de desarrollo en nuestros países. Entonces ese mecanismo financiero es un mecanismo perverso que está planteado, creo yo, como un mecanismo automático hoy en día en Occidente. Por lo menos en los países de América Latina opera de manera muy clara como un mecanismo automático de extracción de excedentes y de condicionamiento constante. Importaba poco si Argentina terminaba de acordar o no con el Fondo Monetario los distintos programas que planteó, porque de todas maneras está condicionado por la necesidad de pagar la enorme deuda que tiene, igual otros países. Entonces, en definitiva, es un mecanismo económico de dependencia, que es algo clásico en nuestra literatura económica latinoamericana, pero yo creo profundizado, luego de la crisis del neoliberalismo, han intentado por todos los medios buscar nuevas formas de dependencia financiera como uno de los carriles importantes. Y eso, claro, no solo impone lógicas de dependencia financiera, impone también lógicas de dependencia productiva, porque las cadenas globales de valor en las cuales están insertos nuestros países están subordinadas a esa dinámica financiera fuertemente. Y la dinámica financiera, si no busca estrictamente los activos financieros, busca la extracción de excedentes a través de algunos tipos de inversiones puntuales. Ejemplo, producciones de materias primas, ¿no? En nuestros países. Básicamente producciones de materias primas, mineras, agropecuarias, agronegocio, etc., ¿no? Entonces, se da esta lógica de dependencia financiera y productiva que empeora mucho las posibilidades de nuestros países de generar, tal cual lo habíamos planteado durante el siglo XX al menos, procesos de industrialización autónoma. Eso no quiere decir desde ningún punto de vista que no haya posibilidades, como planteaba al principio, creo que los profesores lo planteaban con muy buen criterio también. A pesar de estas condiciones, creo que es un un gran momento porque la alternativa productiva está en el sur global. No existe hoy la alternativa de la lógica de producción de bienes y servicios centro de la acumulación de Occidente, y sí existe esa lógica en China y en otros países del sur global. Con lo cual ahí hay algunas posibilidades de pensar lógicas de regionalización de nuestras producciones, de integración cooperativa tanto en lo financiero como en lo productivo, y donde efectivamente la inversión productiva esté en el centro, ¿no? Que es algo que muchas veces aparece como menor. Por ejemplo, no todos los gobiernos neoliberales plantean la idea de que mayor desregulación conduciría a recibir mayores inversiones, sin decir mucho qué tipo de inversiones. Pero solo inversiones financieras pueden insertarse en nuestros países en esa lógica, o inversiones en materias primas. Nunca una inversión productiva vendría en condiciones de liberalización sin generar los mercados, tal cual lo decía el profesor Wen. Si no hay infraestructura, si no hay capacidades que permitan el desarrollo a largo plazo, ¿no? Volviendo un poco a Keynes y también a Marx, esa idea de desarrollo a largo plazo está vinculada a ciertos desarrollos de infraestructura, a encadenamientos productivos dentro de las regiones, cosas que para nada el capital global financiero está dispuesto a generar, sino que está dispuesto a generar la lógica a lo sumo de ingreso y fuga de capital permanente, ¿no? Que es otro mecanismo perverso que está totalmente asociado a muchos de los países del sur, ¿no? La fuga de capital en Sudáfrica, la fuga de capital en América Latina durante las diferentes crisis. En cada crisis uno puede ver que tenemos caída del producto, fuerte caída del producto y salida de capital. Caída del producto y salida de capital. ¿No? Lo han estudiado hasta investigadores liberales, ¿no? La idea del sudden stop o del corte en el ingreso de capitales y la salida abrupta de capital ante las crisis. Ese es un mecanismo que está totalmente instalado. Entonces, la idea de la multipolaridad, yo creo que hay un mundo posiblemente multipolar por construir. No está determinado, está por construir, y me parece que ahí hay elementos muy interesantes para debatirlo. Por último, respecto a la pregunta sobre China, efectivamente coincido con la propuesta del profesor Wen sobre lo real y lo ficticio de la economía neoclásica o neoliberal, ¿no? La mirada sobre China es una mirada que no se condice para nada con la realidad económica, política, etcétera, de China. Aplican un modelo matemático, me gustó esta idea de economía de pizarrón, ¿no? De pizarra. Esa lógica que aplican, la aplican también en lo político. Entonces, en la creencia, digamos, de los proyectos liberales, está fuertemente, ¿no? En esta cuestión religiosa, está fuertemente asociada la idea de crecimiento económico con la idea de democracia liberal norteamericana. Y como si no hubiera múltiples proyectos posibles en el mundo, dependiendo de las múltiples culturas del mundo. Entonces, en buena medida hay una idea de que si funciona en China el proyecto de desarrollo, porque efectivamente hay una modernización económica innegable durante más de 40 años, y en realidad desde la revolución del 49 hasta nuestros días, en procesos de aciertos y errores, pero en una lógica de avance constante, de largo plazo, lo que intentan imponer las miradas occidentales es, bueno, debe ser porque hay una trayectoria desde el socialismo hacia el capitalismo, si no, no puede ser exitoso, porque no cabe en su modelo, sencillamente. Creo que ahí hay una cuestión muy relevante, porque además, ¿no? Y con esto termino de redondear la idea, además no solo se toma para discutir la perspectiva del socialismo chino, sino que se toma para discutir cualquier tipo de intervención del Estado en la economía en cualquier país del sur global, ¿no? La idea de que la intervención del Estado siempre es negativa, siempre es mala y siempre genera errores, ¿no? Tenemos una serie de gobiernos en la región que hoy están diciendo eso o que dijeron eso previamente. Y sin embargo, lo que muestra el proceso chino es, como planteaba el profesor Wen, exactamente lo contrario. Que la intervención del Estado, con mucho control sobre el sistema financiero, como planteaba Paulo, con mucho control sobre la estrategia de creación de mercados, es exitosa. Y es exitosa para el conjunto de la población en China. Entonces, de nuevo, ¿cómo se adapta o no la realidad al modelo? Que es el problema de las lecturas occidentales, creo yo. Es bastante interesante ver y ver cómo podemos, en realidad, rediscutir estas cuestiones, ¿no?, en nuestros países.
Exato. Compreender a China nos demanda dificuldades epistemológicas, inclusive, de apreciação, sobretudo na economia. Vou passar para a terceira e última rodada, e aí eu vou fazer uma pergunta para todos vocês, e aí vocês respondam, enfim, como acharem pertinente. A questão, talvez a questão fundamental do novo período que a gente se avizinha é como garantir que esse novo mundo multipolar e as suas novas instituições, elas não apenas, né, reproduzam os antigos padrões de hegemonia, o que a dependência não se recoloque, né, agora sob uma nova potência. E também o que define uma verdadeira parceria sul-sul em contraste com a relação tradicional dólar-receptor. Vamos começar com o professor Wen.
I think, first of all, once we realize the fundamental flaws of the Western economic theory and the Western controlled world, obviously there's a need to develop, to ensure the emergence of a multi-polar world. That's one. But the polar world essentially is that we need to give the due respect of every developing countries. They can no longer be manipulated by one single monopoly, which is the US, right? But another side of the coin is that developing countries also need to be united, need to be organized. So therefore, they can work together to pursue their self-interest. Because without being organized, united, it was just like Chinese China. They had so much large population, but it was so weak because people were not mobilized and utilized. So therefore, developing countries need to join hands to work together and serve their interest. That's why we need to create new international institutions to serve the developing countries' interest. But when developing countries come together to become united, they still need to think about what is the best planning for their own economy. In that regard, we need a new economic theory to think about what's the right economic theory for development, which nation is at what stage. As I said earlier, every nation, if they want to become developed, you must develop manufacturing first. But it must also, at the same time, be an open economy to engage trade with other nations. That maybe there's a conflict. Country A want to produce a cell phone, country B also want to produce a cell phone. So in that regard, in the history of the Western history, eventually they engage in wars to compete for global market and compete for colonies. So developing countries also need to find a new way for international collaboration and international specialization. But there's not to serve every individual country's interests. That's why they also need a sort of kind of more global government type of organization to coordinate on that. That's not easy, but must be done. Otherwise, developing countries are always controlled by the developed world. That's where economists can play a role. By studying history and come up with some ideas, propose them to the government, and developing country government always have some kind of regular platform to sit together to discuss development.
Muito bem. Emiliano.
Bueno, creo que coincido con este punto, que la cuestión cooperativa es clave para los países del sur global, los países en desarrollo, digamos, o dependientes del sur global. Creo que hay una cuestión importante, tomando el ejemplo de Asia en general, no solo de China, que es la escala, sobre todo para nuestra región latinoamericana y también para África, que en buena medida pensar una escala regional es una necesidad imperiosa, es una necesidad. No podemos en el actual desarrollo de las fuerzas productivas globales y del nivel de integración productiva, financiera y comercial global, no podemos pensar en la dinámica de desarrollos autónomos de mediados del siglo XX, ¿no? De los procesos de industrialización sustitutiva de importaciones en un país, etcétera, sino pensar esa escala continental o escalas continentales, creo que es muy importante, y sí basar la cooperación en la posibilidad de desarrollos que incluyan a las mayorías en el proceso, que es algo que no es para nada sencillo. Yo creo concretamente que no hay una sucesión de hegemonías en el sentido clásico que plantean sobre todo los autores del sistema mundo, porque no hay una lógica hegemónica de China en ese sentido, ¿no? de intentar ir hacia un nuevo orden unipolar, sino por el contrario hacia un orden de convivencia conjunta o de gobernanza global, ¿no? Como ha planteado el presidente Xi. Entonces, en ese plano me parece sí importante ver cuáles son los lugares específicos en los cuales los países del sur pueden insertarse en la dinámica global, pero de una manera que incluya paso a paso a las mayorías en ese proceso. Que es perfectamente posible, en el marco actual, generar una industrialización dependiente y solamente participar en las cadenas globales de valor en lugares, como hoy participamos, en lugares extremadamente marginales, digamos, de las cadenas globales de valor, con poca generación de empleo, con, por lo tanto, poca generación de ingresos para las mayorías. Creo que ese es el desafío, o sea, la multipolaridad se da en el plano financiero, que hay especialistas en esta mesa, por suerte, en ese punto, y también se da en ese plano productivo o en el plano efectivamente de los procesos de industrialización de nuestros países. Ahí creo que la escala regional y la cooperación, la participación cooperativa en procesos de desarrollo global es un punto muy importante para desarrollar realmente un sistema multipolar.
Muito bem. Paulo.
Olha, well, look, I think when we started out in the New Development Bank, we had this question in mind. How can we avoid simply replicating old patterns of hegemony? No? You see, human nature is not easy. No? So it's very easy to fall into a pattern which replicates the old pattern. So Brazil, Russia, India, China become very proud of their new status and start to dictate rules to the smaller countries of the global south. So this is very easy to happen. We're struggling against this, and we have a chance of succeeding, if I may be a little bit idealistic. Why? Because all the BRICS countries, they have a common trait. They all know from actual national experience what it is to be under the control of the West and its institutions. You know, India had until IMF program, Brazil had IMF program, Russia had IMF program, China didn't have, but China has 1 century of humiliation by the West from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th. No? Now look at the global South, simplifying, of course, there are three layers of the global South. China is one by itself because of its size. Then you have large but smaller countries, much smaller than China in economic terms, which are Brazil, Russia, India, and Indonesia. These are the 4 that compose the second layer. And then you have the rest, which is maybe, 150 countries of different sizes and in different regions. The question is, what world will emerge, and how will China, Brazil, Russia, India, and Indonesia behave in this new world? Huh? Because you see, can I give a brief, very brief and quick bird-eye view of the last 120 years or so? First, we had, in the end of the 19th century up to World War I, the first global order in a multipolar world dominated by Europe with the US and Japan rising. That was the first global order. That broke down during World War II. We had instability, Great Depression of the 1930s, Second World War, and then after the Second World War you constructed a bipolar world, one dominated by the US and the Soviet bloc, when the Soviet bloc collapsed in 91, not only the Soviet bloc but the Soviet Union itself, then we had a second global order, more unipolar, because the US had a much more greater role than any of the powers of the multipolar world pre-1914, you see. And now this second global order has also become a thing of the past. The marking point was two marking points: the 2008 financial crisis in the United States and Europe, and the rise of China. So we are in a new world with a geopolitical split, and the question for me is, how are we going to deal with this? I mean, China, for example, will China really play a cooperative? I know that Chinese speak of cooperation, but will they cooperate on an equal footing with all the other countries of the global south? That's a test which we need to see, because, you know, again, global nature, human nature is problematic. So the tendency to be powerful and arrogant and proud happens to all of us. Huh? So we need to guard against that and respect every country, be it small, medium, or large. No? And you know, we're in a very peculiar situation because we have, you know, Antonio Gramsci had a very famous saying in 1930, the old world is dying, but the new world has not yet emerged. So we're in a vacuum where monsters can arise. That was what he said, what Gramsci said. No? So we need to deal with that, and I think the best way to deal with that is not China trying to go alone, but China together with the other countries, especially with the other large global south countries, trying to build a different kind of order, you know. The West will not join, we know. They're very arrogant, they don't want to accept anything that we initiate. Okay, so again, they remain in the 20th century, we will go to the 21st. And I hope this 21st century can be more equitable, more inclusive, more respectful of sovereignty of every single country, whatever the size, whatever the nature of the political regime. And I think countries like China, Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, if Argentina also escapes from its current trap, Argentina can come. At one point, you know, when I was in the fund, we had the BRICS articulation, and Argentina was so close to us that we said we had a BRICS, Argentina plus BRICS. So I think we can move forward. I'm optimistic. I think, you know, we are in a very special moment of history where the voice of global South countries will have a weight, unprecedented weight, provided we come forward with new thinking, new ideas, new theories. And I think we can do that. I really think we can.
Muito bem. A gente tem mais alguns minutinhos. Eu queria fazer uma última passada para que vocês façam as considerações finais e, enfim, falem sobre alguma coisa que eventualmente gostariam de falar. A gente ainda tem mais ou menos 1 minuto para cada um. Vamos começar pela ordem inversa. Professor Wen.
Actually, I would just follow. Paulo just mentioned about his vision, the optimistic vision about the future. I like it very much. I want to add on that. You know, as I said earlier, every nation, no matter what your size is, eventually 2 things. Number 1 is stand on your own feet. You need to be creative, capable of producing things. Number 2, also work with other nations. So the picture or metaphor I have in mind is like eventually all the nations, when they together, you know, when they compete, whatever, it's like an Olympic game. No matter how small a nation you are, you voluntarily join this game, and on every game is fair. There's a rule to follow. Maybe some other nations, they can collect more medals, but on every individual game, it's fair. You know, you put up the same size of team, 6, 8 people, the small nation also, and they all compete on a fair basis. So unlike the first global or the second one, Paulo mentioned, this is jungle law. The Western powers, they just so evilly and plunder, colonize everyone. They become the winner. So eventually, if there's a third wave of global order coming in, as Paulo mentioned, led by some larger nations, had this vision of Olympic game. You know, production is also a game. We compete, but friendly. No individual country dominate everything. You must, you know, if that's the case, we have to allow small countries come up with their new idea of games proposed to the Olympic, right? So that become fair. So eventually we are in a better world.
Well, I very much share Professor Wen's last observations. I think we need to have a different approach, different mentality, different values from the ones that were propagated by the West, you know. Competition, but friendly, as you said. No? Cooperation instead of hostility. No? Equal sovereignty instead of domination. This is, of course, easy to say and difficult to practice. I know. But in my time at the IMF, I learned something I did not expect that I would learn. Because I was the representative not only of Brazil, but a series of countries, including very small ones. And I learned the richness of each small individual medium country in my group, my chair in the IMF. So I interacted with Suriname, with Guyana, with Trinidad and Tobago, with Cabo Verde that I brought in, Timor-Leste, East Timor that I brought in also. No? And this is the approach I think I learned in the IMF. Every country has its contribution to give. No matter how small it may be, maybe a small island, it can give a contribution. And we, the larger countries, need to be open to these contributions. Need to have an open mind, a respectful attitude, not want to guide and dictate and impose things, but let them live their life. We can cooperate with them if they are willing to cooperate, if they need our cooperation. That's the basic approach I favor. No?
A gente finaliza então com o Emiliano.
Bueno, acuerdo con los puntos que se planteaban y creo que es importante tomar esta última cuestión porque que planteaban tanto el profesor Wen como Paulo, porque efectivamente cuando la economía pierde la mirada sobre la integralidad del ser humano y las posibilidades de pensar las naciones y la convivencia entre naciones de una manera virtuosa, es efectivamente un gran problema que estamos sufriendo y atravesando. Sí creo que comparto el optimismo sobre el momento, creo que hay una sensación, una necesidad de construir un mundo diferente. Hay muchas posibilidades, pero también hay algunos riesgos fuertes que debemos tratar de construir a las escalas nacionales, otro tipo también de solidaridades y vínculos, porque justamente los monstruos que emergen son grandes y voraces también en un punto. Entonces también en la escala, en nuestras naciones, lograr poner por delante los proyectos de solidaridad, tanto con otros pueblos como con los semejantes, con los propios nacionales, es algo clave. O sea, depende también mucho de nuestras propias naciones esa posibilidad de construir otra cultura y otra perspectiva de la economía global.
Bom, quero muito agradecer a participação de todos vocês e assim a gente encerra esse debate. Muito obrigada.